This is the 8th of a series of 12 articles on systems thinking, a way of understanding complex organizations and society, offering significant promise for improving the leadership and management of commercial companies, not-for-profit organizations, and government agencies. Part 8. Policy Analysis: What to change to, and how to make the change. By H. William Detmer. Prepared by Michael J. Bolanos Davis. Narrated using AI. Quote: Changing things is central to leadership. Changing them before anyone else does is creativeness. Source of quote: Jay's First Law of Leadership. Quote: Control is the child of planning. Crisis management should not be confused with leadership, it's janitorship. Source of quote: H. William Detmer. All organizations, from families to nations to societies, have policies. A policy is a guiding principle, procedure, or course of action intended to influence and determine decisions, actions, or outcomes. Policies tell us how to act or behave under a certain set of conditions. Formal or informal. The policies that most of us are familiar with are usually written and generally widely known. Typical examples are laws, regulations, standard operating procedures, or house rules. But policies can also be unwritten practices, customs, or etiquette. If you've ever heard someone say, "That's the way we do things around here," or "That's not the way we do things around here," you've heard the expression of informal or unwritten policy. Policies, whether formal or informal, provide stability and a sense of security for the members of an organization, the comfort of the familiar, a sense of security and predictability. People know what to expect, today and tomorrow. Policies obsolesce. But there's a downside to stable, comfort-inducing policies. They tend to be accepted at face value over time, and their continuing relevance is never challenged. This can be particularly dangerous to organizations when the real-world environment changes. Some of such changes are revolutionary, but most are evolutionary. In either case, when there's a disconnect between the way the real world is working and an organization's policies, organizational success is likely to suffer. Almost every significant problem or challenge faced by any organization can usually be attributed to the divergence between reality and a policy that was put into place for circumstances or conditions that are no longer relevant. Identifying and changing obsolete policies. The core of progress and performance improvement, then, is the determination and expeditious change or elimination of invalid policies. Which necessarily raises several questions. How do we uncover detrimental policies? What should we replace them with? And how should we go about it? One of the fastest, most effective ways to model reality and identify faulty policies is the logical thinking process. The logical thinking process. The thinking process is a graphical representation of cause-effect logical relationships. It was conceived in the early 1990s by an Israeli physicist named E. M. Goldratt as a way to analyze the performance of complex organizational systems. Its foremost value is as a policy analysis and business decision tool. As such, it is very much a qualitative, not a quantitative tool. The thinking process is designed to provide the answers to the only three questions any manager needs to know: A. What to change, B. What to change to, and C. How to make the change happen. The thinking process is comprised of 6 distinct logic trees. 1. Intermediate objective map. 2. Current reality tree. 3. Evaporating cloud, conflict resolution diagram. 4. Future reality tree. 5. Prerequisite tree. 6. Transition tree. The intermediate objectives map helps establish the system's goal, the 3 to 5 critical success factors that must be achieved to realize the goal, and the necessary conditions that must be satisfied in order to achieve the necessary conditions. In completing the intermediate objectives map, an organization defines the benchmark of desired performance, those high-level milestones that define the organization's desired course of travel. The current reality tree is a cause-and-effect diagram that explains what policies are behind the divergences, or gaps, between what's happening in the real world and the desired course determined in the intermediate objectives map. The originating root causes are inevitably the policies that are inadequate or outdated. The terminal conditions in the diagram are undesirable effects, statements of deviation from the desired course. In between is a clear representation of the component interdependencies that produce systemic results, a view of the system that is typically invisible to observers in their day-to-day work. The evaporating cloud, often called a conflict resolution diagram, is a necessary condition diagram intended to help resolve basic conflicts surrounding the need to change policies. It succinctly exposes the contending arguments, change versus don't change, and, most important, the underlying, usually hidden, assumptions behind each side of the change issue. Surfacing these hidden assumptions is the key to resolving the conflict in a win-win manner. The future reality tree is a kind of solution bench test. It's a way of logically demonstrating that a proposed change will deliver the desired results before investing substantial time, money, and energy in implementing it, only to find out that it was doomed to fail in the first place. By constructing a future reality tree, change agents can enable others in the organization to see how the change is expected to unfold so that serious omissions or errors can be detected and corrected ahead of time. This tree is a kind of insurance policy that the contemplated actions are the right ones. The prerequisite tree is an implementation planning tool. It helps to structure the complex activities of executing the policy change, the effectiveness of which was validated in the future reality tree. The component activities and tasks, what must happen first, and the obstacles that must be overcome are arrayed in the sequence required for expeditious, effective execution. The finished prerequisite tree usually depicts an interdependent network of activities that are easily convertible into a project activity network. In other words, change implementation can be managed as a formal project, with discrete performance, cost, and schedule parameters. A transition tree converts the prerequisite tree, which is usually more like a framework of complex activities, into step-by-step guidance for completing these component tasks. This tool can be useful when the tasks are to be completed by people who are not familiar with the steps for doing so. It is also effective in explaining why particular steps must be accomplished in the order specified. An example, the Solomon trees. Nothing substitutes for a good picture. If you follow the links for each tree, you'll see a complete set of thinking process trees constructed to show how the dilemma faced by King Solomon in the Old Testament of the Bible might have been resolved using the thinking process. Note, the trees included here were expanded and adapted from thinking process trees originally constructed by Dr. Eric Noreen of the University of Washington. The original trees were first published 1995, in Dr. Noreen's book on the theory of constraints. Now, Solomon didn't really use the thinking process, it hadn't been invented 3,000 years ago when this story reputedly took place. But it could have been used, and, more important, it's representative of the kinds of qualitative problems, the ones not possible to quantify easily, that the thinking process can be so valuable in solving. For those not familiar with the original story, King Solomon was asked by two women to decide which of them should have custody of a single baby that each claimed was her own. Solomon was widely respected throughout Israel for his wisdom, and everyone expected him to justly resolve the dispute. Here's the full story, in the original King James Version. There came before Solomon two women that were harlots. And one of the women said, "This woman and I were delivered of children in the same house within 3 days of each other. But this woman's child died in the night because she overlaid it. And she exchanged her dead baby for mine while I slept. But she claims the dead baby is mine and the living one is hers." And both women protested at one another, each claiming the one living child for her own, and they beseeched Solomon to decide which of them should get the child. 1 Kings 3 verses 16 to 22. Observation, because this is a narrated document, all referred figures are presented on screen and the logic narrated. Solomon had a challenging problem to solve. Let's assume that he knew how to use the thinking process. If so, he would have first constructed an intermediate objectives (IO) map to help keep him oriented toward his overall goal, and the critical success factors that must be satisfied to achieve it. The IO map is read from top to bottom, verbalizing it as, in order to, I must. Here's what Solomon's IO map might have looked like. Keep in mind that the system we're viewing in these trees is a personal one. These are Solomon's personal trees, not the kingdom of Israel's, so they reflect his goal and necessary conditions.
Solomon's intermediate objective map. In order to have a peaceful, fulfilling reign as king of the Israelites, I must have personal satisfaction, fulfillment, and I must have respect and admiration of people, and I must have peace and prosperity for the population. And in order to have personal satisfaction, fulfillment, I must have fun ruling Israel, and also I must preserve and enhance reputation for great wisdom. Also, in order to have respect and admiration of people, I must dispense justice equitably and effectively. Also, in order to have peace and prosperity for the population, I must deter wars with Israel's neighbors, and also I must enhance Israel's economy. And in order to preserve and enhance reputation for great wisdom, and in order to dispense justice equitably and effectively, and in order to deter wars with Israel's neighbors, and in order to enhance Israel's economy, I must make wise decisions all the time.
With his compass set in the IO map, Solomon then constructs a current reality tree, CRT, that accurately characterizes his immediate situation. Solomon's CRT is on the next screen. The CRT is read a little differently than the IO map. Start from the bottom and read each block with the words if, and, or then preceding them, as indicated on the diagram. A complete causal statement has at least two blocks connected by an arrow, a cause, the if statement, and an effect, the then statement. Contributing dependent causes are the end statements. The critical root cause, the one that, if addressed, solves the problem, lies at the bottom of the tree. This tree provides focus to improvement efforts.
Solomon's current reality tree. If both women desperately want the baby, and if I can't figure out a just resolution to the dispute, then there are two women screaming at me, and this is an undesirable effect. Also, if I can't figure out a just resolution to the dispute, and if the baby is upset by all the commotion, then I've got a crying baby on my hands, and this is an undesirable effect. Also, if I have the reputation of being extremely wise, and if I can't figure out a just resolution to the dispute, and if people expect an extremely wise person to be able to resolve any dispute, then my reputation for extreme wisdom is in danger, and this is an undesirable effect. The identified critical root cause is not being able to figure out a just resolution to the dispute.
Solomon is faced with a dilemma: how to be just and resolve the dispute between the women at the same time. His next step is to construct an evaporating cloud, EC. This is another tree that is read in order to, I must. Solomon's EC is just below the CRT. The injection is an idea for a solution to the dilemma, but it needs a little logical testing before Solomon is ready to try to implement it.
Solomon's evaporating cloud. The objective is to come to a just resolution in the dispute. Therefore, in order to come to a just resolution in the dispute, I need to be just, and in order to be just, I should not give the baby to either woman. On the other hand, in order to come to a just resolution in the dispute, I need to resolve the dispute, and in order to resolve the dispute, I should give the baby to one of the women. That shows a conflict between not giving the baby to either woman, and giving the baby to one of the women. I cannot do both, so both options are in conflict. After thinking carefully on this dilemma, I will consider proposing to cut the baby in half and giving each half to each woman, and this will be my injection to come to a just resolution in the dispute.
Logical verification comes from a future reality tree, FRT. It's another if-then tree, like the CRT, and Solomon's FRT demonstrates how his chosen injection from the EC leads to the effects he desires, ones that reflect the satisfaction of the IO map's necessary conditions. Solomon's FRT is on the following screen.
Solomon's future reality tree, first draft. If the real mother is more motivated by love for the baby than envy of the other woman, and if I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, then the real mother would prefer giving the baby up to the impostor rather than see the baby die, and then I would know who the real mother is. If I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, and if the impostor is motivated more by envy of the other woman than by love for the baby, then the impostor would prefer the baby's death than relinquishing the baby to the real mother, and then I would know who the impostor is. If I know who the real mother is, and I decide to give the baby to the real mother, then the real mother is happy. If I know who the impostor is, and I threaten the impostor with prison if she doesn't leave immediately, then the impostor leaves. If I know who the real mother is, and if I know who the impostor is, then everyone realizes that I have resolved the dispute equitably, and if everyone thought the dispute could not be justly resolved, then my reputation for wisdom is enhanced, and this a desirable effect. Also, if the real mother is happy, and if the impostor leaves, then the commotion is over, and therefore the women are not shouting at me anymore, and also the baby stops crying. Both are desirable effects. But then I realize that my proposal to cut the baby in half could not work if the impostor fakes caring for the baby, and I must find ways of dealing or avoiding this to happen.
But Solomon was no dummy. He recognized that the law of unintended consequences often came into play. In scrutinizing his FRT, he saw what is known as a negative branch, a logical future extension of the injection that leads not to desired effects, but instead creates new undesirable effects that did not exist before the injection was applied. The negative branch that Solomon discovered is below the FRT.
Solomon's negative branch. If I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, and if the impostor may mimic the behavior of the real mother, for example, expressing concern for the baby's life, then I can't distinguish the impostor's behavior from the real mother's, and then I can't distinguish the impostor from the real mother, and then I am back where I started. All the original undesirable effect remain in place.
How he dealt with it is on the next screen.
Solomon's trimmed negative branch. If I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, and if the impostor may mimic the behavior of the real mother, for example, expressing concern for the baby's life, and if jealousy, rather than the baby's welfare, motivates the impostor, then I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby. Therefore, I will offer 1,000 shekels to each woman, in addition to half the baby. If I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby, and if I offer 1,000 shekels to each woman, in addition to half the baby, then the jealous impostor is tempted by the offer of money. Also, if the real mother is more motivated by love for the baby than envy of the other woman, and if I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby, and if I offer 1,000 shekels to each woman, in addition to half the baby, then the real mother would prefer giving the baby up to the impostor rather than see the baby die, and then I know who the real mother is. If the jealous impostor is tempted by the offer of money, then the impostor accepts my solution, or at least hesitates after hearing about the money, and then I know who the impostor is.
After trimming the negative branch, Solomon went back and modified the original FRT. That revised FRT is also on the next screen.
Solomon's revised future reality tree. If I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, and if the impostor may mimic the behavior of the real mother, for example, expressing concern for the baby's life, and if jealousy, rather than the baby's welfare, motivates the impostor, then I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby. If I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby, and if I offer 1,000 shekels to each woman, in addition to half the baby, then the jealous impostor is tempted by the offer of money. If the jealous impostor is tempted by the offer of money, then the impostor accepts my solution, or at least hesitates after hearing about the money, and then I know who the impostor is. If the real mother is more motivated by love for the baby than envy of the other woman, and if I need a way of discerning the difference between jealousy and real concern for the baby, then the real mother would prefer giving the baby up to the impostor rather than see the baby die, and then I know who the real mother is. And the rest of the original future reality tree remains the same.
With his course of action now clear before him, Solomon was ready to plan the implementation of his injections. For this, he used a prerequisite tree, PRT, provided on the following screen. Notice, again, this is an in order to, we must kind of tree. Each task in the rectangular blocks is needed to overcome an obstacle with which it's paired. But in its entirety, the PRT shows the sequence of activities that must place in the order in which they must occur. Also, if there are tasks that can be completed in parallel, rather than in sequence, this is indicated too.
Solomon's prerequisite tree. In order to, I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, I must. I don't tell the priests about my plans, because priests are terrible actors. They'll give my scheme away if I let them in on it ahead of time, and I get the priests out of the court temporarily, because the priests might intervene to save the baby. In order to, I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman, I must. I brief the royal executioner ahead of time not to act on my decree, because the royal executioner might cut the baby in half before I can stop him. He is a really eager employee.
Solomon's final task is to orchestrate the step-by-step execution of the FRT and the PRT. Another if-then tree, the transition tree, TT, reveals the logical sufficiency of the individual step-by-step actions needed to do this. Solomon's transition tree is at the bottom of the following screen.
Solomon's transition tree. If the priests must follow my commands in temporal matters, and if I need to get the priests out of the court while I deal with the baby decision, and if I dismiss the priests, asking them to attend to another matter in the temple, then the priests are not present to intervene. If the priests are not present to intervene, and if the executioner is not in on the ruse, and if the executioner might cut the baby in half before I can stop him, then I need to keep the executioner from acting on my threat. So, I call in the royal executioner, ask him to ready his sword, but secretly tell him not to hurt the baby in any way. Then, the royal executioner will not act on my threat, and the royal executioner starts honing his sword in full view of the assembled court. If the two women don't know what I will threaten to do about their claim, then my decision announcement will have maximum dramatic impact. If my decision announcement will have maximum dramatic impact, and if the royal executioner starts honing his sword in full view of the assembled court, and if the royal executioner will not act on my threat, then I am ready to make my decision known. So, I propose cutting the baby in half and giving half to each woman.
Solomon, of course, followed these steps, and the rest, as they say, is history. Conclusion. The thinking process is a tool of unique capability. Governed by the categories of legitimate reservation, it provides a rigorously logical cause and effect picture of the reality as it exists now, and as it might exist in the future. As no other tool does, it excels at revealing the complex interdependencies among system components, and between the system and its environment. The thinking process and these capabilities are more thoroughly explained in other sources. While the thinking process was originally designed to solve problems, it has much broader applicability in the domain of strategy development and deployment, as we'll see in the next installment. Quote, "The essence of management is recognizing the need for change, then initiating, controlling and directing it, and solving the problems along the way. If it were not so, managers wouldn't be needed, only babysitters." Source of quote: H. William Detmer.